African governments have traditionally relied heavily on domestic tax revenue to support development projects. With most economies across the continent facing serious budget deficits, the continent has been challenged to find alternative sources of financing development. Presenting on the innovation in guarantee products and fiscal aspects during the 2016 MEFMI Combined Forum, the Managing Director, Institute of International Finance, Mr. Tran, highlighted that fiscal positions of most economies across the region remain worrisome and cannot match to current huge developmental needs.
That level is now rising again. In one country, more than 70% of GDP. For several countries, between 50 and 60% of GDP. For sub-Saharan African countries, those are very high levels because of the low threshold of public debt that these countries have. Budget deficits on the rise again. One country more than 9% of GDP last year, a few countries 7 to 8%, and so on and so forth. So basically, we are at this point where the need for mobilizing investment is great, but the fiscal circumstances for many countries are not great. And therefore, the tasks for many countries are much more difficult and more challenging because of the need that you have to do two things at the same time. You have to find a way to improve your environment, legal framework, blah, 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 to encourage investment. At the same time, you have to urgently undertake fiscal stabilization. You have to put your fiscal house in order to be sustainable. Otherwise, the thing will be exploding out of control. To do two things at the same time is very difficult. It's difficult to do one thing at a time, but to combine both under pressure of fiscal deficit and debt is very difficult.
The former Deputy Director at the International Monetary Fund, IMF, stressed that war guarantees provide risk mitigation and credit enhancement solutions. Their uptake has remained low due to a myriad of challenges, chief among them the absence of sound regulatory framework to support their use.
For sub-Saharan Africa, the number of banks never ever use these schemes is quite high, 27%. So we asked a series of questions to ascertain from them the reasons for such low usage of these schemes that have been made available to encourage more investment in infrastructure projects. Number one, by far, from our respondent is legal enforcement in the recovery process. When things go wrong, when the borrower goes bankrupt, when there's losses, the process, the paperwork, the bureaucratic procedure that the banks have to go through to claim or to make recovery is very long, very arduous, very difficult, and very costly. So that has been specified as a number one impediment to the use of these guarantee schemes. So it's clear that needs to be improved. It's clear that it has been part of the many comments in the so far this morning about the overall legal regulatory environment of the countries that need to be improved in order to facilitate these issues. So second point is high fees. The comment and the complaint really is fee too high, either collected upfront or on an annual basis, and that really deter potential users of these guarantee schemes.
World Bank Chief Economist for Africa, Dr. Albert Zofek, told participants that while guarantees will address the risk issue, African governments should do more in improving the policy environment and investment climate.
What the international community cannot do is the policy environment, and it's upon us in our countries to do it. Let's fight corruption. As the Minister for Uganda said, let's fight corruption. That's number one. Second, let's make sure we set up the right regulatory framework that is attractive to private investment. In some countries, we still have regulations that are so difficult to allow a PPP to take place.
Given the regulatory uncertainties in most economies across the continent, and the weak business environment, guarantees are expected to facilitate and increase the private sector involvement in the African infrastructure sector.